Well, after the U.S. Supreme Court rulings on abortion and presidential immunity, along with the justices' potential conflicts of interest, many people are questioning the court's integrity. And in a poll in April, 51% of Americans disapproved of the way the Supreme Court is handling its role. Now, President Biden is proposing the court have a code of ethics that can be enforced, and he suggests an 18-year term limit on the justices. And I'm wondering, Tara, are term limits a good idea?
Well, first, of course, let's remind everyone that, of course, when you become a Supreme Court justice, it's for life. So you would have to have basically an amendment, and that would have to, first Congress has to make the proposal, you have the amendment, then of course it has to be sent out to the states for ratification to do any of this. So that's the first issue. But the second issue, I think, is the fact that term limits have become much more of an issue as people live longer. And as clearly you were seeing now, and this has been a big debate about cognitive ability. And, how physical do you need to be a Supreme Court justice, so to speak, as opposed to what we've seen with President Biden and his campaigning, et cetera. So term limits are much more realistic, I think, now than they were in the past, because in the past you didn't really think that someone could actually serve as a Supreme Court justice for 30 or 40 years, all depending on when they were appointed. And with medical technology being what it is much more likely that someone can serve for that length of time.
Yeah, Justice Stevens, I think he retired when he was 90 years old, 90 or 91. But the fact of the matter is most Supreme Court justices really don't do much of their own work. They have 5 or 6 law clerks that do the heavy lifting, but ultimately the decision is there. I want to echo a little bit of what you said about this plan. I see it as pie in the sky, precisely because in order for you to reverse, say, for example, the Dobbs abortion decision, which was based on an interpretation of the Constitution, you would have to change the Constitution, which requires a 2/3 vote in both chambers of Congress and a 3/4 ratification by states, which just ain't gonna happen in this period of polarization. There is some low-hanging fruit that Democrats could turn to. Just as during the Roosevelt years, there's the option of packing the court, of jurisdiction stripping, something I've talked about before. But also, you could flood the court with the 10,000 or so petitions that they get every year and make them unable to carve out a policy agenda that would make them more powerful than I think the framers initially expected them to be. So some of this makes sense, some of it is pie in the sky.
Well, I think term limits make sense. I mean, I agree with you that there's actually probably more effective and quicker ways of changing the court, which is adding members. But that's not really politically popular, and I think it would be seen as kind of more partisan, whereas there's high public support for term limits. And so this is not an immediate solution to the fact that the court seems very unresponsive to the will of the people. But I think over the long term, the idea is over the long term, it would become more responsive through the electoral connection. And one of the problems of why this court is so outside, I think, of the Democratic mainstream, and I mean small d Democratic, is that they hold that the Republicans have lost the presidency, the popular vote, I should say, out of the 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, and yet they have appointed 6 of the 9 justices. So you can lose elections and still have a majority on the Supreme Court who, as Tara said, these people are serving for an average of 26 years as opposed to about 15 years in the past. So you have these 9 people who have an extraordinary power over our lives, seemingly indefinitely. I mean, if Kamala Harris wins, she might not be able to appoint anyone if she were to be reelected too. In 8 years, she would appoint no one because of the composition of the court right now.
One concern I have is that public trust in the Supreme Court has plummeted, right? So in the early 2000s, it was around 60%, it's now around 40%. So going back to your point, the public doesn't see the Supreme Court as a neutral arbiter in the way that I think we had at times in the past seen it as a neutral arbiter. The Supreme Court's never been perfect, right? I think we do have this problem of glorifying the past, and we know that there have been many problematic cases in the past. But nevertheless, there is a crisis right now, I think, and the legitimacy of the court is in jeopardy. Something has to be done. What that is, I don't know.
Yeah,
Quickly.
well, I just very quickly, I want to caution about the importance of judicial independence, not just now, but reflecting back in the past, when the Warren Court overturned tons of precedent to implement criminal rights, civil rights, women's rights. All of what we're complaining about in regard to this court were complaints that Southerners lodged against that court. So what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. So we need to think about what happens with the next administration or Congress.